All right. There we go. That's a check. There we go. And how do you sound?
Check, 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 check.
Turn it on.
Check, check. How's that sound?
There we go. That sounds pretty good.
All right.
Maybe turn mine down a little bit and turn yours up a little bit. All right. Looks pretty good to me. And I'm just going to check the volume here. Seems like the volume is doing okay. Yeah, all right. Just let me know when you're ready to go live.
I'm ready when you are. Just send me a wink.
We should wait a few minutes.
Yeah, we'll wait just a few
Wait a few
minutes.
minutes.
Yep.
You want something to drink?
I'm good. Thank you.
Yeah, water.
I'm Scotty, by the way.
Hey, Scotty.
Hello.
Figured I'd introduce myself.
Everybody's talking at me. I don't hear words they're saying. Only the echoes of my mind. People stop and staring. I can't see the faces. Only the shadows of their eyes. I'm going when the sun keeps shining through the pouring rain. Going where the weather suits my clothes. Banking under the northeast wind, sailing on a summer breeze. Skipping over the ocean like a stone. I'm rolling when the sun keeps shining through the pouring rain. Going where the weather suits my clothes. Banking over the northeast wind, sailing on a summer.
We can go comedy.
You want to tell everyone outside to come in?
Yeah, I'll just cut this and
Everybody's talking at me. Can't hear words they're saying. Only the echoes of my mind. Yeah,
Maybe I should give it a maybe I'll
my love no, I won't let you leave my love behind.
Yeah, the security folks will stay outside. They can't really do effective security from in here, so.
Yeah, that's true.
You could read my mind, love. What a tale of hospitality. Just like an old time movie, about those premonitions in a castle dark or a fortress strong with chains upon my feet. Lord, I know she's been. I will never be set free as long as I'm a ghost. You can't see.
Scotty, can you do me a favor?
Yeah.
Can you make sure all three lights are turned on?
All three lights?
By the door? To the left of the door?
Oh yeah, they're on.
All three?
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
I got you. I'm gonna say this music is top notch.
You won't read that book again because the ending just too hard to take.
Oh, cops are here.
I walk away
Here because someone from
like a movie star who gets burned in a three-way
Are you exercising your rights? Look at that. Security was necessary after all. Wow. Why do you ask?
Never thought I'd go out this way. I got to say that I just don't get it. I'm so
Yeah.
End of the song.
Okay.
the feeling's gone, and I just can't get it back. If you could read my mind, love,
One more verse.
what a tale my thoughts could tell. Just like an old time.
Hey man, I got all night. Don't worry about it. You can repeat the song if you want. Catch the tail end of the song in the live stream.
Harry Chapin.
I've been Harry Chapin too.
If you read between the lines, you'll know that I'm just trying to understand the feeling that you have. Never thought I could feel this way, and I've got to say that I just don't get it. I don't know where we went wrong, but the feeling's gone, and I just can't get it back.
Oh, short ass arms.
All right, good evening, everybody, and welcome to Red Ink Community Library, where we are hosting the second installment of our Constitutional Speaker Series, a look at the Bill of Rights and the civil liberties enshrined within them, and how they are changing as the threat of capitalism advances and takes more of our human rights away. Tonight, we focus on the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms in the United States. With us, we are joined by a local mutual aid group, one that is focused on preserving and maintaining as much as possible the ability to secure and defend our communities in as democratically way as possible. We're joined by Dan from Rhode Island John Brown Gun Club, and we welcome him to Red Ink Community Library.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for being here. We really appreciate your participation. We're looking this evening at, like I said, the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms. And there have been significant developments just this year in 2022 about changing the way that those rights are defined and exercised in our country, as well as calls from different parts of the political spectrum to modify those rights. So I was wondering if you could start by giving us a little bit of a background on the Second Amendment, what it's about, and how it's been used in the United States.
Sure. Yeah. So that's a pretty big topic. So I've got a lot to cover here. So I just want to first off thank you to Red Ink very much for hosting this event. I think this is a great series that you all are doing, and we really appreciate that you reached out to the Rhode Island John Brown Gun Club to discuss this particular issue. And so, like, before we get into the discussion of, the right to self-defense, the right to bear arms, the issue of gun violence, just a brief introduction for who the Rhode Island John Brown Gun Club is. So the Rhode Island John Brown Gun Club is an independent organization based here in Rhode Island, focused on community defense and mutual aid. Our work primarily centers around outreach with the unhoused community via our food and supply distribution runs that we do every week downtown, as well as anti-fascism and firearms education and safety training for marginalized communities. Most of what we do on a day-to-day basis is focused around our mutual aid runs, where we go out each week and distribute food, drinks, warm and cold weather clothing, depending on the season, hygiene supplies, clean socks, hand warmers, blankets, harm reduction supplies, and COVID supplies like masks and hand sanitizer to hundreds of our Providence residents that are forced to sleep outside. We also, from time to time, provide security for events happening in the area. If anybody watching or was here at Red Ink for the Anti-Fascist Forum that was held a week after the local Nazis showed up to hassle the reading of the Communist Manifesto that was being held here, with various local groups, you may recognize some of our members, who you may have seen at other events, and because we provided, security for that event as well. And so, but in addition to stuff like that, we also reach out to people to offer education services on a one-on-one basis for folks who may be from oppressed identities, who are not, and very understandably, are not comfortable seeking out such training from the typical group that is usually where everyone's funneled into, the NRA. Because the NRA is fundamentally a white supremacist organization and an extremely reactionary institution.
The National Rifle Association.
Yes, not the National Restaurant Association, which that has its own problems, but not the same ones. So we do all this work under a broad understanding of the meaning of the term community defense. We believe that as an anti-capitalist, anti-racist, anti-sexist organization, that all marginalized communities, all those groups targeted for oppression by white supremacists, both within and outside the capitalist state, deserve the ability to be able to defend themselves. We take a holistic view to what defense means, because I think a lot of people, when they hear the term community defense, they just think of pictures of maybe other John Brown Gun Club groups, or from years in the past, like Redneck Revolt, or some of the other groups that have done armed defense at actions, like, for instance, the groups in Texas defending drag sorority time or drag brunches, or all these events that have been protested by fascist groups. But that's just a part of what we consider the phrase community defense to mean, because in our view, that you can't just focus on the punching Nazis aspect of community defense. If you really want to defend our communities as a whole, that involves doing whatever we can to help the marginalized and oppressed in our communities. And a lot of that work means doing more along the lines of what I think most people are used to understanding as mutual aid, which is we don't have the resources to provide housing. The state should be doing that. But thanks to the work of our members and the extremely generous donations that we've gotten from many people who live in Providence, we've been able to provide supplies to folks that have been forced to live out on the street for the last 5 years running. And we consider that just as much community defense as doing security at actions, because on the day-to-day, a lot of the poorest and most oppressed people in this community, they may not be being constantly hounded directly by fascists, but they have a lot of needs that are not being met by the state. And if we do anything to help that, then, you know, that's just as much a part of community defense as anything else. Additionally, we're a non-sectarian organization. Like, beyond our commitment to general anti-capitalism, we have members who are anarchists. Like, I myself am a Marxist-Leninist. We have people with different ideological tendencies across the broader left, but we're united in our shared commitment that the poor and oppressed in our country are either left completely abandoned by the state or directly repressed by them, and that we should do all we can to help the poor working class members of our community. So that's kind of just a setup of who we are. But then, so getting into the broader question of, you know, the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, and all this stuff. Unfortunately, may seem a bit rambly, but it's going to require. There's a lot of history behind this that I think we need to get into.
All right, so let's start with the Bill of Rights as it was formulated in the late 18th century. The Constitution was being rewritten, and there was a lot of framework within the text of the Constitution about how the government would be set up and run, but not a whole lot of civil liberties enshrined within the Constitution itself.
Right.
And so the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, and very near the top, the Second Amendment, was the right to bear arms. Do you know why it was included?
Well, that's the thing. There's that you get a different answer depending on who you ask, and that's like what. It's a good question, but it's one that's very colored by the character of whoever's giving the response. Because, like, a lot of right wingers will say that was put in there as an individual right to self-defense, and it was because we needed to have this unviolable right of people to defend themselves and their property. That's not why the Second Amendment was included in the Bill of Rights. And like, I can give you an answer, but I would actually prefer to give you an answer from somebody who's been studying this a hell of a lot longer than me. Like, I think just to get into some of the critiques real quick that you often hear from people, well-meaning people, of the Second Amendment, especially, like, this comes from a lot of like folks on the liberal side of the spectrum. People will start going after, well, the Second Amendment says, you know, a well-regulated militia, and that's what it's about. It's about arming a militia, and therefore it doesn't mean the individual right to self-defense, and therefore we should be able to ban individuals from owning firearms. I don't actually think that's a great argument to go with. Frankly, I think it's a bit of a red herring. Also, just as a tactical suggestion, you're never going to win an originalism argument with the right, because I hate to say it, they're more correct about the intention of the framers of the Constitution. And that's not to say that you should agree with the people on the right. It's that the framers of the Constitution had very bad intentions when they put it together. Is despite the hagiography to the U.S. Constitution that we're bombarded with every day of our lives, as if it is some holy document that was like granted. It's like you had Moses was given the 10 Commandments and the founders were given the Constitution. Like, the Constitution was written by the richest landowners in the United States, almost every single one of whom was a slave owner. And you can't understand the writing of the Constitution without knowing that. And so, to get back to what I was talking about before, like, that's why I lean on the expertise of somebody like Dr. Gerald Horne, who's the professor of history and African American studies at the University of Houston. He's a prolific author of many fantastic history books. I specifically recommend the Counter-Revolution of 1776, a great book. But he's talked about this issue specifically, and so, like, he has a quote that I would really just break out to really explain to people the basis for what the Second Amendment really is and what it was written to do. So I pulled this from an interview that he did a couple of years ago, where he said, quote, "Like most provisos of the U.S. Constitution, formulated in the late 18th century, there was both a class and race bias to these provisions, which is one of the reasons why it's so difficult for people of color today to receive constitutional protection. What I mean is that the Second Amendment certainly did not apply to enslaved Africans. All measures were taken to keep arms out of their hands. The Second Amendment did not apply to indigenous people because European settlers were at war with the indigenous people to take their land. And providing arms to them was considered to be something akin to a capital offense. So the Second Amendment was mostly applicable to the settler class. Keep in mind that even after the U.S. Civil War, when the enslaved Africans are freed, a good deal of the battles of the bloody Reconstruction period, circa 1865 going forward, was about keeping arms out of the hands of Black people. And indeed, one of the central reasons why the terroristic Ku Klux Klan was organized in the post-Civil War era was precisely to disarm Black people. Militias were needed precisely to repress rambunctious and rampaging enslaved Africans and marauding indigenous people. And that is what the Second Amendment was all about, end quote. And so that is really aligned with how we view the Second Amendment. And now that does not mean that because, the U.S. Constitution is a reactionary document that should have been thrown away and replaced with a better one long ago, that doesn't therefore mean that every right in the Bill of Rights, we necessarily, want to do the exact opposite of it. Because, there are some things in there that are important, like the right to free speech, which you just did a whole, one of these on. But it's important to understand when we look at this, that it's because we support the right to bear arms as a fundamental right of all human beings to self-defense. We don't support the right to bear arms in the furtherance of maintaining a system of white supremacy in order to maintain capitalist domination over the vast majority of the people in this country, and specifically focusing the worst parts of that oppression on Black and brown communities, which is what the Second Amendment was designed to do.
Great. Yeah, no, absolutely. And so you set up there through the words of Dr. Horn, a really nice framework for our conversation here today, that the Second Amendment was built on a foundation of both class and racial oppression.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought, at the risk of being perhaps non-intersectionalist in the moment, I thought we might take those two separately and talk about the history of the conflict inherent in those two identifications. So I thought we would start with class. And you mentioned that the Constitution itself was written by landowners, but by very wealthy landowners, people who had the ability to be famous and to be published in newspapers and to travel to Philadelphia and New York and those places.
Yes, George Washington was the richest man in the colonies.
So
it's like if the Constitution was written by Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk. This is the thing. Everybody, when you say the founders had bad intentions and they were bad people look at me like you have two heads. But if you come at it from that angle, like, do you want a constitution that's written by the Koch brothers and Warren Buffett and Bill Gates, or do you want one that's written by the people? And that's where we're coming from.
Absolutely. So let's talk about the function of class in the Second Amendment. And so you mentioned a little bit about how class has worked to enshrine, how the Second Amendment has worked to enshrine class divisions over the last 250 years. I was wondering if we could get into maybe a couple of examples, perhaps either strike actions or other conflicts between the working class and the capitalist class, and how the Second Amendment came into play in some of those scenarios.
Sure, absolutely. And this does get into the history of why we support the right to armed self-defense by the people generally. Like, again, this is of course centered in the United States, but we don't think that any rights are inherent to the citizens of one nation or any other. These are universal. But to your question, though, it is kind of hard to separate those class and racial elements with really anything in the United States. It's hard anywhere, but in a country that's based on settler colonialism and the hundreds of years of enslaving Black people, it's very difficult to come up with like examples that don't include both. But there are some that are leaning more towards one side or the other. So like one example that I would always bring up for people is during the early years of the labor movement in this country following the Second World War, not Second World War, following the Civil War, you had a period of about 70 years where you have the formation of real unions like that actually have power, but where there's no legal framework to give any sort of protection to any workers' labor rights in this country. And that period was a period of extreme violence against people trying to organize in the working class. So like specifically, I mean, one of the examples, it's going to be, one of the most common examples that folks would cite, because it's one of the biggest sites of armed conflict on US soil following the Civil War, is the Battle of Blair Mountain. And the general like period that where it was often referred to as the mine wars in the early 20th century in this country. So like for example, in the late like 19th century and early 20th centuries, the labor movement grew in this country. You didn't just have companies saying, no, you can't unionize. No, I'm not going to recognize your union. It's if you try to unionize my mine, I'm going to hire some people and they're going to shoot you. So like, this is not the sort of situation that you can resolve through like complaining to the local authorities who wouldn't help you anyway because they're on the side of the mine owners. So during this period, like across the coal fields of Appalachia, you had company towns that were completely controlled by the coal barons who owned whatever mine it was in the area. And they employed like essentially mercenaries, but groups that were commonly referred to as detective agencies as a way to differentiate them from just we hired some guys and gave them guns. And so you had groups like the Baldwin Felts Agency and the group that was most commonly known from this period and still exists today and is still working to break unions, the Pinkertons, who've recently been hired by companies like Amazon to fight labor like upsurges there. So if there's any because I think there's a lot of mistaken ideas about this period that like following the NLRA, we entered this period of permanent labor peace, and it's extremely not true, even though the character of some of this resistance changed. But specifically, during the 1914 strike in the coal fields of Colorado, private forces hired by John D. Rockefeller and the Colorado National Guard attacked a tent city that had been erected by striking miners in Ludlow. They strafed the tent city with machine gun fire and killed 20 workers and their family members. These were not strikers who had, just been shooting at the National Guard. They were attacked because they were forming a union. And so following the Ludlow massacre, you had workers all over the country being like, look, I want a union. I want to be able to actually have a job that isn't going to kill me at the age of 30. And I want to have a wage where I can actually support a family. But I don't want to go up against a machine gun with my bare hands. So you started to see like unions forming armed auxiliaries during this period because it was a matter of very imminent self-defense. And so like in 1920, the UMWA, the United Mine Workers of America, made a major push to unionize the coal mines in West Virginia, and they were immediately met by violence from the coal companies. If anybody's ever seen the movie Matewan, great film. If you haven't seen it, check it out. It chronicles some of the events right before the Battle of Blair Mountain, which included a battle in the town of Matewan between armed company thugs and armed miners, which resulted in multiple deaths on both sides, but did also result in running these mercenary forces out of the town. And in August 1921, 10,000 armed miners gathered in the area of Blair, West Virginia, demanding the right to unionize. And additionally, not only, to be able to form a union, but for the union to actually be recognized. Because there were plenty of these places where workers got together, they formed a union, and the bosses were just like, nope, don't care. You want anything, like, I'm not going to ever give it to you, and the government's never going to force me. So the only thing that's ever actually won rights in this country, that's actually enforced anything that the workers have ever need, has been direct action. It's just that during this period, that direct action wasn't met with necessarily just calling the police. They would just bring in armed goons to shoot at people. And that's exactly what happened here. You had 3,000 men, including hired mercenaries from the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency, as well as local and state police forces working in concert together to assemble a force to suppress the gathering of the miners. On August 29th, company and police forces attacked the miners, and they even used private planes to drop bombs on the miners, which is the second instance in U.S. history of an armed aerial attack on U.S. soil, only after the Tulsa Massacre, which had happened just a few months prior to the Battle of Blair Mountain. Miners fought back, though, and they actually managed to push the company forces to the brink of defeat, though taking severe casualties. And the conflict was only actually brought to a conclusion because the president threatened to bring federal troops in to crush the strike wave. And so there was, in the immediate aftermath, there was a pretty harsh toll on the miners. There were over 100 miners killed by armed company forces, and hundreds more were arrested. However, despite those losses and the repression of the state, the legacy of the resistance of the coal miners and the fact that they demonstrated to the state that they were willing to defend themselves from this sort of company violence lived on following the action. And a decade later, the NLRA would be passed, giving collective bargaining rights to everyone in this country, which are, of course, being eroded every day. So that's like the primary example I think I would point to for that, like the way where the right to bear arms has been vital in specifically class-based struggles.
So, forgive me for jumping right to the end there, but you mentioned that one of the legacies of the Battle of Blair Mountain is the passage of the NLRA, and to draw like a straight line between armed resistance to capital and a legislative victory. I'm wondering if would it have been possible to pass the NLRA had it not been for the example of the armed resistance to capital at Blair Mountain, or is the struggle itself a part of the process?
I mean, it's kind of impossible to answer a counterfactual like that, but I'm not just going to be a jerk and ignore your question, like, because I can't go back in time and change something and tell you what would have been. But I think it's not necessarily that, like, because the miners picked up rifles, 10 years later we got the NLRA. It's because workers showed that they were willing to defend themselves by any means necessary. It is the only reason the workers felt the need to pick up rifles in Blair Mountain and there are plenty of other struggles, was because of the armed attacks they were facing from the bosses. So the counter to that is less specifically whether they were going to be the ones arming themselves, and the alternative is they don't defend themselves from the armed miners, and it crushes their union movement. Now, there are plenty of strikes that were incredible. Like you had, for instance, the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. That did get very violent, but there wasn't necessarily this huge use of, organized armed union auxiliaries, largely because unions were still very young at the time. And that produced a lot of response from the state, and it did, allow for some unions to get a bit more acceptance. But even that case where you didn't have workers necessarily, drilling in rifle corps or anything, they ended up defending themselves against the National Guard because the only other option was to stand there and get shot by them. So it's specifically that right to self-defense, and the way that you go about that self-defense, because again, it's defense, it tends to be dictated by the means being used by the forces of capital. So in order to answer that question, I guess I would say, if Blair Mountain never happened, say that period never occurred, would there still have been the NLRA eventually? Probably, but like if the Blair Mountain hadn't happened where it did, you would have seen other armed conflicts. Or if you have, I don't know, if you had some sort of like Quaker labor movement where there's absolutely no resistance to violence ever, pure pacifism or whatever, I do think that probably would have made it a lot less likely for the passage of the NLRA to happen. But again, like I can't really say with 100% certainty that if history had been completely different, what would the outcome be? It's hard to predict.
No. I'm right there with you. I think that it is fair to say that the things happened the way that they happened, and they couldn't have happened any other way because that's the way that they happened. But at the same time, I think it is important for us to take that example of history and to learn from it, to say that while there were some examples in the late 19th century and early 20th century of unarmed resistance or active unarmed resistance, however you can term it, because there were also examples of organized armed resistance, that it was part of the movement, and it was an integral part, and something that cannot be taken away from it and cause the same result.
Right. And I think actually, like, if you don't mind me sort of jumping ahead a little bit, I think actually, if we look at examples from US history that are more focused on the other side of that sort of like dichotomy of race and class that you raised earlier, I think we can see some of those same historical through lines.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's jump right into the civil rights movement.
Yeah.
I think that's a really nice place to go from here, where we see two very different characters, pre 1968, post 1968, and so how does the tone or the tenor of organized armed resistance change in the civil rights movement, and then after the assassination of Martin Luther King, how does that transform?
Right, and there are two examples from this period that we always use because they're exemplar of exactly what we're fighting for, but also because a lot of this history is not really taught. Like there's a common dichotomy that's thrown out there between, as you said, like the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement, where one of these is the like doing things the right way and being nonviolent, and you show up and you have your protest and you hold your sign, and eventually the people in power say, okay, you're right. But that's not an accurate history of what the civil rights movement was. Because there's this idea that you can separate these two groups as if they aren't completely related to each other and influenced each other constantly. And the other thing is that's really important to get into is the entire conception of the early civil rights movement under with Martin Luther King, SNCC, CORE, all these groups as a purely nonviolent movement is simply factually incorrect. Like it is ignoring a huge amount of history that backed up these nonviolent groups. And again, this is not to in any way diminish the incredible heroism of the people in these nonviolent groups like SNCC and CORE and other groups, because they did incredible work and that was incredibly brave and very, they faced like horrific repression from both the state and non-state forces.
Many were killed.
Exactly. And because of that, because they were facing all of this, violence, just in the same way that as the miners in West Virginia faced violence and responded by defending themselves, so did the Black community in this country. Like the one group that we as John Brown Gun Club always want to point people to because they're never talked about. I mean, look, maybe you people people who got a better education than I did, maybe you've heard of them, but I certainly wasn't taught about these folks when I was growing up, which is the Deacons for Defense and Justice. And they were a group that was formed in November of 1964, specifically to provide armed protection for Black civil rights protesters and Black communities more broadly who were facing intensified terrorism from both the police and the KKK. Following the assassination of Malcolm X, a few months after their formation, the group began to grow at a great speed across the entire South. The Deacons were largely made up of Black veterans of World War II, and they provided armed protection for civil rights leaders like James Farmer, who was the head of CORE. Their presence allowed the non-violent groups to carry out their actions without the constant threat of violence from white supremacist groups, including, of course, the local police. And so, like, for instance, in 1966, the Deacons provided armed defense for the March Against Fear after James Meredith was shot in the early stages of the march from Memphis to Jackson, Mississippi. After they began protecting the march, armed attacks on the participants stopped. Because one of the things that history teaches us about, armed fascist formations, which I usually refer to as like parastate organizations, because there's an idea that's very promulgated in liberal education that groups like the KKK have nothing to do with the state, and that's not true. They have had these sorts of white supremacist terrorist organizations have had direct ties to the armed apparatus of the United States, be it the military, be it the intelligence formations like the FBI and the CIA, or be they just local police organizations. I think at this point, since the last few years, most people are probably well aware of the extreme overlap between groups like the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, all these various militia groups with police forces. And that's not something that's new. Like, that's always been a big part of what the cops do. And so it's important to understand that there is this overlap between state and non-state forces here. And yet, each time you had groups like the Deacons show up, you had like these attacks stop, because a lot of these parastate formations, their whole strategy is to pick on groups that they see as soft targets. So they'll go after a group they know is going to be nonviolent. But if there's even a small presence of people who have shown that they are willing to defend themselves and others, suddenly that becomes a lot scarier of a proposition. And so even without doing any sort of violent action whatsoever, these groups, simply by being armed, were able to really provide a huge amount of protection for groups like SNCC, like CORE, I mean, for instance, there was a cross burning after the integration of the Jonesboro Public Library, and the deacons just like passed out pamphlets and made it clear. They're like, look, if anybody's getting threatened, if a cross shows up, like if you have a cross burning near you, let us know, and we'll start doing patrols in that area. And suddenly, surprisingly, cross burnings in that area stopped because they knew that there would be opposition. And so I think it's always very important to point to groups like the Deacons, not just to learn from their direct example, although I do think that's very good, but also because it's really important to examine the ways in which we're taught our own history and the ways in which we are not taught our own history, because it's very useful for the ruling class in this country to tell everybody a very nice story about the civil rights movement, about how a bunch of people got together and protested an injustice and they waved a bunch of signs, and then the people in power were very nice to them and they heard them and they said, okay, here you go, you can have some rights now. Because that sort of a style of history, that sort of like historiography of the civil rights movement lends itself to the liberal concept of the way change happens. Change according to the liberal worldview, and again, this I know this terminology is a little different in the United States versus most of the rest of the world, but the liberal worldview includes most Republicans. Because again, it's two wings of the same party. But the liberal worldview of how change happens is that you get enlightened people into power, and then those people with their great intelligence and magnanimity, they press things forward and they give people rights, which is not how change happens. Change happens through class struggle. And class struggle includes things like the civil rights movement, because in the US, you can't, because that's the thing, like we're sort of trying to talk about like separating class from race. You can't really do that. And so like the civil rights movement was as much a movement of the poor and oppressed in this country as it was, you know, I mean, a purely like racially based movement because of the history of this country. You can't separate 400 years of slavery from like, you know, the levels of poverty in the Black community. That's a straight line from US policies to the reason that poverty is there. And so these struggles are always going to be linked together. And those are the struggles of mass groups of poor and oppressed people demanding change and showing that they're willing to defend themselves in the process. That's how you actually make real change.
Absolutely. So unfortunately, we do have to take another sort of jump in time and start integrating some of these topics. As we move through the devastating economic policies of the 80s, we get into the immigrant communities of the late 80s, early 90s, the mass migration from Central and South America to the United States, from East Asia to the United States, following the many wars that the U.S. fought in East Asia throughout the mid-20th century. And it results in the violence following the Rodney King beating and video being shared on news. And then 2 years later, the assault weapons ban. So how does, and I suppose this is a question more so about the media than anything else, but how does the perception of who uses guns change the way that we feel about the Second Amendment in the United States?
Oh, I mean, that's kind of the whole ballgame about the way that the media presents the firearms issue, because this is, again, I think this is another place where it's important to understand how broad the reach of the capitalist state is, because there's again a misconception that like the private media in the United States is again somehow separate from the state. But when the state apparatus is constructed to serve the billionaires, and the billionaires are the ones that own the media, there's going to be a big overlap between the ideological like narrative that you're getting from the so-called private media and what you're getting from the state. And so it actually all kind of comes back to the original purpose of the way the Second Amendment was written, which is you see this over and over and over again in the media. If some sort of like violent crime is committed by a white person, usually a white man, somebody who looks like me, like you are going to get a vastly different, not only amount of coverage, but style of coverage in the media for the result of that crime than you would have even a significantly lesser offense by anybody who's Black or brown, or really anybody who isn't white, really, especially focused on like Black, brown, or indigenous folks. For most of the media is either, but it's really anybody who isn't white. And this actually leads to one of the ways that you sort of get this synergy between like deep red states and deep blue states, because I think there's a conception that like the pro-gun versus anti-gun lobbies in this country have a differing view of how guns should be used in the state. But I really think if you go back to the high enough, like if you abstract enough, ultimately, even like what they're aiming for, and I mean specifically the politicians here, not the protesters, because like while I may disagree with the many folks on liberals and even on the left who want to ban firearms, who want to restrict firearms heavily, the overwhelming majority, I think, have absolutely good intentions, and that they just want to end gun violence, and we do too. We just differ on how to do it. But when you get into the political class, there's other considerations there. And specifically what I would point to is the combination of pro-gun laws in like states with far-right governments with the regime of mass incarceration, because those two things pair towards what the original purpose of the Second Amendment was. Because the purpose of the Second Amendment wasn't to say every citizen in the United States or every person in the United States, because I don't really care if somebody's a citizen or not, like should be able to be armed. That's not what it was. It was that the white settler class should be armed, so that should there be a rebellion of either indigenous nations who, the settler class has been trying to take all the land from for 400 years, or by the Black community, formerly enslaved population, that if those populations ever had any sort of resistance to the rule of white capital, that there would be this sort of pool of surplus repression that could be called on by having a heavily armed white populace. So that's another thing, because people will talk about how free because you'll see people on the right talk about like free states, as in states that have very few gun restrictions. But those states are not free states if you have a criminal record. Because if you have like pretty much any felony on your rap sheet at all, you cannot own a firearm in this country. And so when you have a state that specifically creates a regime of mass incarceration in the late 60s, early 70s, especially starting with Nixon, but hyper accelerating under Reagan, specifically targeting Black communities in order to criminalize them, to destroy the Black freedom movement that emerged out of the 60s, and to provide not only for that means of social control, but to then turn that into a means of profit generation through the use of prison slavery. So you have this enormous apparatus in this country that is aimed at locking up as many Black men as possible in order to A, disenfranchise them, B, provide a slave labor force, which is used by many of the largest corporations in this country to make huge profits by paying essentially nothing for labor costs, and C, to disarm that population. So if you can be in Texas and they can say like everybody can have a AK-47 in Walmart or whatever. It's not everybody. It's, for the most part, it's going to be mostly white people, because when this country locks up at some point in their life, 1 in 3, I think is the number, Black men, I may be getting that specific number wrong, but it's something egregious like that, then you have an enormous population of people that have had their right to vote stripped from them, and that have also had their right to own a firearm taken away from them. And what that comes along with it is a way to reinforce that regime of mass incarceration, because one of the unintended, and one of those things that I really don't think most people who want stricter gun laws want as a fallout of that, is that you now have one of the single biggest drivers of mass incarceration in this country. Because this again gets to another misconception. There's this idea that the war on drugs only locked people up for what are commonly referred to as nonviolent drug offenses. Again, that's not true, because what this country considers a violent offense is an extremely expansive group. And arguably the single biggest driver of the current regime of mass incarceration in this country is the criminalization of the possession of firearms, because it serves as an escalator where if you have somebody who, because they have some sort of prior felony conviction, even if it's like some minor thing that they went to jail and they did their time or whatever and they're back, if that person even just possesses a gun, they're not doing anything with it, they haven't harmed anyone, they haven't threatened anyone, they haven't brandished it in any manner. If they are caught possessing that firearm, that can be enough to throw them back in jail for 2, 5, 10 more years. And that sort of thing really continues to drive what we still have as the system of mass incarceration in this country.
I think really important there to point out how the function of the state serves to reinforce what you were talking about, the original intention of the Second Amendment. I want to talk now about the 21st century and the sort of confounding aspect of the increasing visibility of gun violence and gun death, especially after the sunsetting of the assault weapons ban. We see a lot more media attention being paid to gun violence and gun death, and especially high-profile instances of gun violence and gun death, and specifically a lot more, and subsequently a lot more activism around either reinstating the assault weapons ban or going further and trying to limit the use and existence of guns in the United States.
Sure. Yeah. So just to start off with, one of the big differences you'll see from us versus pro-gun people on the right is those folks will tend to just say, "Oh well, gun crime doesn't happen," or like the only way to stop gun crime is to lock more people up for other reasons or whatever, which we of course do not agree with. And I also don't want to minimize the horrors of so many of these awful mass shootings that have happened. Uvalde obviously being one of the big recent ones, but like awfully there have been so many, like it's very hard to remember them all. The problem though is that like with the coverage is that these events are horrific and tragic, but the way that they're responded to in the media is on the most emotional level that they possibly can be. And it's understandable, because how else are you supposed to react when you see something horrific like 20 kids get shot? I mean, that's fucking horrible. Like, I don't know if I'm supposed to swear or not, but like it's one of the most horrific things you can imagine. The problem with the response to it of therefore we need to bring back the assault weapons ban, therefore we need to enact high capacity magazine restrictions, whatever, or we need to ban the ownership of firearms entirely, is sort of twofold. You have a problem with it is a solution that doesn't really look at the source of the problem. And it also doesn't look at the history, because during the period where the assault weapons ban was in play, the of homicides by firearm in this country did not significantly decrease. So like it's you can't point to the history of the assault weapons ban in this country and then say we just need to go do that because we didn't have mass shootings when that was around. That's not true. Like I wish that was like a magic button that would suddenly stop all crime, because then it would be a much more complicated thing, because it'd be like, well, I think people should be able to defend themselves, but if I know I pass this law, then all these horrors will stop. Then, I mean, that's pretty hard to argue against. But that's how these policies are usually sold. The idea is that if we ban people from owning AR-15s, then there won't be any more shootings with AR-15s, and then there won't be any more mass shootings. Again, the numbers and the history just doesn't bear that out. Like, for instance, during the decade 2007 to 2017, there was an average of 13,657 homicides in the United States annually, which is incredibly high rate. It's I believe we have a homicide rate about 5 times the average comparable developed nation, I think is the usual terminology used for it. But the number of those homicides that were committed using so-called assault weapons averaged about 0.1%. So that's like, again, it's in the hundreds, which a single one of those deaths is a horror and a tragedy. But if we want to look at the actual numbers and look at, okay, we want to reduce gun violence, the vast majority of gun violence in the United States, and really in any country that has like legal firearm ownership, is almost all done by handguns. And that you then run into problems with like the Supreme Court, where you don't have to agree with the Supreme Court's rulings, but like the Heller case specifically has ruled that that the interpretation of the Supreme Court, which is a reactionary institution that is essentially decided that an unelected council of 9 elders gets to decide what all of our rights are, which that's bullshit. I'm not defending the Supreme Court, but just laying out the terrain that people are talking about. The Heller case has basically now written into U.S. judicial precedents that it is a constitutional right to own a handgun. So you literally cannot pass a state law that bans people from owning handguns. And handguns consist of, again, well over 90% of gun violence in this country. So I sympathize completely with the people who want to stop these horrific tragedies like Uvalde. But if we're going to stop those sorts of tragedies, we have to actually look at the root causes behind these sorts of things. And that's one of the things that is so frustrating to me about the way these events are covered. Because in the media, it is always an appeal to, if we rush out and we do something, and what do something always means is ban some sort of firearm, then this will stop from happening. And there's never any discussion of, is that true? Is there any evidence for that? Nor any discussion of, if we ban these weapons and this thing does not stop from happening, then what do we do? Because again, it never gets to, why do these events happen in the first place? All that we ever hear is, this was a crazy person, they went nuts, they lost their mental faculties, they or some other individual explanation for, again, why there are 13,000 homicides in this country every year. The vast majority of them not mass shootings. Again, 99.9% of them not committed with rifles of any kind. I think it's actually even smaller if you narrow it down to whatever is considered an assault rifle. So the thing that is so frustrating about the coverage is that it focuses on that, and it never discusses what every study on the sources of crime tells us, which is that crime, including violent crime, in pretty much any society, is primarily driven by socioeconomic causes. Because most violence that occurs with firearms occurs because people are pushed into situations that they would, outside of a system that tells people that their worth is based on how much is in their bank account, and that if you don't have any money, then fuck you, you can go starve. That's the sort of society that we live in, and that's what creates the situations that put people into the place where they feel that the only way that they can, survive is oftentimes by being pushed to the edge of the economy into situations where there's areas that are prone to violence. And it is this lack of opportunity that people have, where again, this is all tied into why we do our work trying to help, the houseless in this city. Not because if we don't, we think that the houses are going to be violent, but it's because nobody else isn't doing that. The state refuses to help people. And so people get pushed into desperate situations, and that's where the vast majority of crime, not all crime, not everything, but that's where the source of these issues are. And we feel that if we don't address these root causes, that even if you put in an assault weapons ban, a mag ban or whatever, that's not going to solve the problem. And we don't want to just pass a law to make ourselves feel better. And then when the same thing happens again, throw up our hands and be like, well, they were crazy. What are we supposed to do?
Well, thank you so much for jumping into solutions, because that's exactly where I wanted to head next. And I thought I would start with technology, because this is an argument that we hear frequently, that gun technology either has come too far or is too effective, and is certainly not what the framers intended, and they had a different conception of what a firearm was, and so that the solution to solving the problem of gun violence and homicide in the United States is a technological solution, whether it's a fingerprint scanner or, like you said, limited capacity or limited function of the firearm. I don't mean to ask too leading of a question, but one analogy that I would like to draw is that for 10,000 years, people were drinking alcohol, especially drinking heavily, but only in the late 19th century and early 20th century were they doing so, and then operating heavy machinery.
Sure.
And then, which notably led to some very high-profile accidents and some very needless loss of life, and added a lot of fuel to the temperance movement. Are there any parallels between that period in world history, especially in American history, and the sort of folly of prohibition in the United States?
I mean, I think I get what you're saying, but I don't know. I think they're a little different, partially just because I feel like it's a bit trite to compare people who are pushing for gun control laws, even ones that I disagree with people pushing to get rid of alcohol. I mean, I get that the people doing that were also felt they were doing it to save people's lives, but I just think it's a little different. But to your point, again, I think this gets back into a question of less of thought experiment and more of data, because the question of the technological question that comes up and again, we don't care what the framers were envisioning because the framers were terrible people who wrote the Constitution for terrible reasons. So like, I don't really care what they intended when they wrote the Second Amendment. But it's a valid issue that gets brought up of like, look, it's one thing to say people have the right to own a firearm when you have a single shot musket and it takes you a minute and a half to reload. And by that time, if you miss the guy, they can come up and stab you or something. Or more importantly, they can run away. Like, the problem again comes down to this issue of like this idea that, for instance, so-called assault weapons, which usually people mean AR-15s or something like that. And again, you can see the inconsistency in whatever people envision that to mean if you look at the different state laws that have assault weapons bans, where you'll have something that's legal in one state not be legal in another state, and they both supposedly ban assault weapons, because this is a very murky like definition. But even if we just say AR-15s or semi-automatic rifles with detachable magazines, that sort of thing, which is usually the broader definition of what an assault weapon is. Again, we look at the numbers of where most of these deaths coming from. The ones that get the most coverage are the ones that involve assault weapons. But that's not the most numbers. Again, over 99% of all firearms homicides in this country occur using handguns. And handgun technology has not fundamentally changed since 1911. Like, really arguably before that, but I'm just using, the invention of the 1911, which is the technological basis for essentially all modern handguns. It's literally, there has not been an enormous technological change in the weaponry that is used to commit the most violent crimes in this country. Because again, the reason that handguns are used in those situations is because they're small and concealable, and you can hide them on your person. You can't hide an AR-15 on your person. And so it becomes a bit conspicuous to walk down the street carrying one. And it's a lot harder to get away with some sort of crime or whatever you're trying to do with one. Which is, so if what we're trying to do is say that, okay, the technology is too advanced, so we have to go back to technology, like how far are we going back? Like, what does that mean? I think it gets again into the more important issue of like, when we study this, what is actually causing the crime? But then you get into two questions here with what you were asking about with technology. What causes crime and what potentially makes crime more lethal? Because that's something where you could say a AR-15 is a more lethal firearm than a 1700s era musket. That's why the military uses M16s instead of muskets. But again, you have to go to the numbers. If the problem was technology, we would see that the reason behind that spiking murder rate, which I will point out, despite those very large numbers, and we do want them to be much lower, those numbers are vastly lower now than they have been in they've been going down my entire life. Like the violent crime in this country, I believe, peaked in the late 70s, early 80s. And it has been consistently going down since then. You'll actually hear some defenders of mass incarceration say that, oh, this is because we locked everybody up, which is not true, but you'll hear people throw that out there. But so there's a consistent perception from the media that crime is always going up. The murder rate is always going up. And a big part of that is purely a smokescreen to get people to support more money for police. Because if there's more crime, then we got to have more police. Despite the fact that the U.S. is the most heavily policed country on earth. So if more police meant less crime, we would have no crime. But to the question of technology, again, if the technology was too deadly, then as technology advances, you would see the lethality of violent crime incidents increase. And we don't see that in the data. What we do see is that as poverty in an area increases, the amount of violent crime tends to increase. When we see populations that are abandoned by the state, when we see the end of programs like welfare in this country, when we see the destruction of public housing, when we see entire communities, especially in rural areas, that have been hollowed out by deindustrialization, by the complete withdrawal of any sort of governmental support. And those places then turned into communities based entirely on incarceration. Where instead of having a mill in a town, now you've got a prison, and that prison is now the source of all the money for the town. And that then becomes an economic incentive to lock more people up. All of these things create an environment that makes violence more likely. And so as we see, communities where there's no job opportunities, there is no affordable housing anywhere. I mean, look, in Providence, what is it, like 50% of families in this city are rent burdened? It's ridiculous. It's completely untenable. But like, it's when you look at where the concentrations of the most abandonment in this country are, where the highest levels of poverty are, that's where you see the highest rates of gun violence. And that is, again, not to blame poor people, to say that poor people are naturally violent, because they're not. It's not true. The problem is that people get pushed to violence to solve problems if they feel they have no other option. And if you don't know where you're going to sleep, if you don't know where you're going to get food, if you have no idea how you're going to provide for your family, it puts you in a situation where you may feel that that's your only option. And so our argument is that rather than focusing on these technological issues, which again, the data just simply does not bear out as a root cause for the rates of violence in this country, that if we actually looked at, say, well, all these areas where we've cut off any sort of state assistance to people, where people have no real chance to build a better life for themselves because of state abandonment, again, not because of anything they've done, but because they were unlucky enough to be born in a country like the United States that doesn't give a damn about you if you don't have, $1 million. Everybody else is just left to fend for themselves. And so our understanding of this problem is that it is primarily, though not entirely, socioeconomically driven. And so if we want to solve this problem, that's where we should be concentrating our efforts. And one other thing I just want to add real quick. If we want to do literally one sort of legal maneuver to try and reduce violence in this country, to reduce homicides in this country, the number one thing we could do above all others would be to disarm the police. Because over 1,000 Americans are murdered by the police in this country every single year, with the full backing of every level of government. Because you have this old qualified immunity bullshit that basically says cops can go out there and murder people. Like, I just saw a video today on Twitter of a cop who shot a kid in a Burger King parking lot because he was sitting in his car eating a burger. That guy's, at best, that guy might get fired. He's absolutely not going to go to jail for it because, again, police have complete impunity to just murder people in this country. So the single greatest move we could make towards a less violent society, if we just want to pass one law, change one thing, the single biggest thing we could do is remove the ability of the police to murder our fellow workers at a whim.
Thanks. It's all the same video, and I had the same reaction. Similarly, news broke today that the entire Uvalde Police Department was put on suspension, and they've been replaced by the Texas State Patrolmen. It just one cycle of violence replaces another.
Mm-hmm.
You've already shown many times throughout this conversation that you're something of a fighter, and so I want to push you a little bit.
Sure.
It sounds like your argument relies on a stipulation that gun violence and the Second Amendment are not related. That the two are come from two different places, and so the solution to gun violence has nothing to do with the Second Amendment itself, and that those who would seek to link the two are going down the wrong path.
Well, so sort of. I wouldn't say they're entirely related, because then again, you get into the question of, when you say the Second Amendment, do you mean the Second Amendment or do you mean the right to bear arms? Because again, we view those as very different things. I know a lot of people in the US don't, because there's this framework of rights come from the Constitution. We don't consider human rights to come from a document written 250 years ago by a bunch of racist slave owners. Like, rights are universal. And so we believe that the right to self-defense does not come from the Second Amendment. But to get to your question, so specifically relating to the Second Amendment, I would say there's a link, but not to the fact that the Second Amendment allows people to own firearms, but to the fact that the Second Amendment is specifically targeted at maintaining the regime of white supremacy in this country. Because that's another thing that I didn't get to in our previous discussions, because while the vast majority of crime in this country is socioeconomic in origin, there is some that isn't. And that tends to fall into two categories. You have domestic violence, which can be socioeconomically driven, but isn't always. It primarily comes out of patriarchal, like ideological structures that have been, that honestly predate capitalism, that have existed really as long as there's been class society. And that's something that is going to have to be fought, that we need to fight now in under capitalism, and would still need to be fought even under a socialist country. Like there is, you know, as much as I recommend people join a socialist organization and push to like have socialism because it would solve most of our problems, there's no goofy illusion that like, oh, you have a revolution, you have socialism, and then suddenly there's no domestic violence. That's not how people work. It takes a long time to get rid of these sorts of bigotry and other forms of ideological structures that are created by class society in order to divide us against each other. And so fighting things like patriarchy and white supremacy, those have to be a key part of all of our movements right now, and is something that I wish like that the folks that are fighting to stop gun violence, that was as much a part of their focus as their focus on firearms, because I think they would actually get a lot farther going after those structures. But unfortunately, the problem comes into the fact that then you have to get into a broader analysis of, well, where does patriarchy and white supremacy come from? And then you start looking into, well, seems like our state is sort of founded on those things. Might have a whole lot we need to change. So I can't say that the Second Amendment is completely divorced from the gun violence in this country, because again, the Second Amendment isn't just you have the right to bear arms. It's in a specific racial, class, and gendered framework that is basically white men, and at the beginning, white men who own property, and then shifting over time, are allowed and should be armed. And that is, of course, part of those broader, patriarchal white supremacist structures that have to be dismantled as part of an attempt to build a more egalitarian society and get at some of these causes. But as to the question of, I think really more where you're going with this is like, is there any link between the fact that the United States is the most heavily armed country in the world and the fact that there's so much gun violence? And I would say yes, but it's not a problem you're going to solve by trying to take guns out of people's hands, because that gets into an issue that I think is difficult for a lot of, especially liberals, to deal with, which is the difference between what you write in a piece of legislation and how a law is enforced. Because there's a conception that if I write a law that says no one is allowed to have an assault rifle, then everyone will turn in their assault rifles, or if they don't, eventually the police will arrest them and catch them. That's not how laws work. That's not how laws are enforced in this country. Laws are enforced by people. And anybody, I think, who is fighting for a better world in this country knows that the people enforcing the laws are not on the same side of that issue. Again, you have direct violence from the state in the form of over 1,000 murders of Americans. And that's, I believe, just American citizens. Like, it's a lot higher when you include all of the deaths caused by Border Patrol, caused by all the other repressive groups in the United States, especially on non-citizens. And so, you get into the problem that the people enforcing these laws have absolutely no interest whatsoever in disarming the most violent and most heavily armed groups in society. When you see SWAT raids to go after what they have tips on illegal guns, those aren't happening in middle-class suburban neighborhoods, which is where most of those guns are. They're not kicking down the doors of people who are in the Oath Keepers or the 3%ers because they're like, this guy has an illegal short barrel rifle, which I guarantee you a lot of those people do. They're not doing that, partially because that would mean arresting half the members of the police forces in this country, but also just because, again, they enforce the laws against the communities they're supposed to enforce them against, which is poor communities and Black and brown communities. And so when it comes to the question of, is there any link? There's a link at the level of lethality, but you're never going to there's a misconception that if you could get the political capital to repass the nationwide assault weapons ban, that you could snap your fingers and get rid of every assault weapon, every high capacity magazine. And you can't. There's 400 million of them in this country. And the police have no interest whatsoever in enforcing them. I believe there's actually a law in the books in Missouri that makes it illegal for local police forces to cooperate with the ATF in any sort of firearms law. So you literally just can't pass that law there. And secondly, I would also point to the problem that even if that did work, even if you could wave a wand and magically get rid of all the firearms in this country, you're basing that on a state that has now concentrated all of the tools of violence in its own hands. So the very group that is, again, killing over 1,000 people every year with no consequences whatsoever, now they're the only people who are armed. And so that to me does not seem like a particularly good solution to this problem. And so while I totally understand where people are coming from when they push for these sorts of restrictions, I really think it's important that we look at like what's causing the violence in the first place. Is it because somebody has access to a gun, or is it because somebody doesn't know where their next meal is going to come from? And they think, okay, look, I have every job I've tried to apply to has fired me, or they won't hire me because I can't afford to buy a suit and because I have no, ability to get money from anywhere, because we have a system in this country that prevents millions and millions of people from being able to find employment that can actually support their life. And that's the problem. If we don't address that, we're never going to solve the problem of violence. We're just going to be nibbling away at the edges and concentrating more power of armed force in the very people that are oppressing those communities in the first place.
It's something of a cliche here at Red Ink. We always boil things down to historical material conditions.
Yeah.
Then again, everything does boil down to historical material conditions. There are a lot of things that I would have loved to have gotten into. You mentioned that there's so much that we could talk about: the military-industrial complex, the fetishization of the tactical operator after 9/11, and all that stuff. But I wanted to use the time we have left to turn it over to the audience here that we have in the library, and see if anybody has any questions, anything that they would like to know about from Rhode Island John Brown Gun Club. Yes.
Oh, hi. So I took a class on the Black Panthers in college, and we read the book Negroes with Guns by Robert Williams. I was wondering if the deacons that you talked about were interconnected, like with Robin Williams, because I had never heard about the deacons before, so I was really interested.
So the question was about the Deacons with Guns and the Black Panthers, and any possible connection between Robert Williams and the Deacons.
Yes, Robert Williams was connected with the Deacons for Defense and Justice, and they were. For folks who don't know, Robert Williams was a very militant fighter for Black liberation in the United States, and he was very much on the lines of look, these people like the KKK are coming out here and shooting people for nothing. So if we're not out here defending ourselves, what are we doing? How are we actually going to get anything done? And it got to the point where his advocacy of armed self-defense forced him to flee the country because the United States was trying to persecute him as a terrorist, basically. So he actually had to, for a while, flee to Cuba as the only nearby place that was actually fighting for Black liberation is not terrorism. So there was a connection, yes, but I don't, off the top of my head, unfortunately, I don't know exactly what the I know that he was involved with the Deacons for Defense and Justice, but I don't know exactly what the overlap was. So apologies on that. But I know they were in contact at least.
Thank you. Is there a book that you recommend we read about the Deacons about?
That's a perfect question for Reading Community Library. Is there a book that we can turn to?
Yes, there's a book, That Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed.
Hell yeah.
The author escapes me off the top of my head, but it's a fantastic book. That's where I originally learned about the Deacons for Defense and Justice. They talk about the history of armed self-defense with the Black Panthers and really all these groups throughout the civil rights movement and how critical they were and how their history has been suppressed. So I can't recommend that book enough.
It's not paid product placement, but currently on the shelves here at Reading Community Library. That Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed. Any other questions that we can take from the audience?
I guess you brought up the strikes in Appalachia and moving forward into the civil rights and the Black Panther movement. I wanted to kind of go back towards the founding of the country, and you brought up the a book by I forget the author's name, The Counter-Revolution of
The Counter-Revolution of 1776 by Dr. Gerald Horne.
Thank you. A thing that comes up for me as a post-counter revolution that I bring up to people all the time on this issue is the Whiskey Rebellion.
Mm-hmm.
I would love to hear your take on that if you'd like to.
So the question was about going all the way back to the foundation of the United States and the Whiskey Rebellion, the use of of armed rebellion in the United States?
Yeah, so like I'll admit it's been a little while since I read all the details on the Whiskey Rebellion, but the general like framework was, you have the revolution in the United States, and a big part of that was this idea like we're not going to have any taxes unless we vote on the taxes. And then right after the revolution, suddenly the country has all these debts and they need to pay them. And well, the rich people that founded the country, they're not going to pay them the same way they don't pay for anything now. So they decided, we'll do all the pros. They like to, they buy all this whiskey and they're getting drunk all the time. So let's tax whiskey and we can get a bunch of money that way and that'll help us pay down all our debts. And so a lot of people are like, wait. Didn't we just do a whole war so that we wouldn't have to do this? And so you actually have an armed rebellion of people being like, no, I don't want to pay this tax. I didn't vote for this tax. Screw you guys. And that was one of the first, rebellions in the United States, outside, of course, of the constant resistance by indigenous nations to the U.S. repression that you actually saw in the United States, and was yet another case of like the U.S. being like, we believe in freedom, but only for rich people.
Yeah, really interesting stuff, and it reminds me of a story I heard this week about the Boston Tea Party, and it is a unique concern for those of us here in Rhode Island. We like to hype the fact that we had a very different reaction to the taxation of tea here in Rhode Island than they did up in Boston. But learning that it was actually a reduction in the tax on tea, and the racketeering that the very rich people of Boston were doing was actually being undercut by the reduction of the tax in the tea in Boston, and wanted to protect their racket, and so they threw all the tea into the harbor.
Well, I mean, it's the same thing you see with like, what are the two biggest countries like fighting to, stop drugs all around the world? It's the United States and the UK. And where did a huge portion of the ruling class in the United States and the UK get their wealth? Forcing opium onto China during the 19th century. So the US has a very long history of having these extremely hypocritical, campaigns that they just end up justifying as, well, we control the press, so we'll just make you think it's fine.
Great. Let's take another question.
Yeah, so I see Rhode Island John Brown Gun Club supporting everywhere. Everyone needs any community that organizes it, that needs security, always seeks out. I see you folks everywhere giving that support. But when it comes to right to bear arms, the same group of people won't stand with you, right? So how do you? So I'm just trying to. You did mention the powerful lobby of NRA. So NRA is like the white supremacist arm of the white supremacist arm. They know how to arm people, right, of the right. How do the left can create, or the socialist people seeking power, how can they create similar strong organization, convince people to come to us, come together? Because it was, you mentioned Black Panthers Party, or I would just also add American Indian movement, but those movements were based on national self-determination, right? The oppressed nations were fighting. So there was an incentive there, right? But now such a national self-determination question is not so salient anymore. So how do you do that same thing now?
All right. So the question's about arming the left, and how, in the face of the fact that the NRA, the National Rifle Association, is so effective at arming the right, and the left, or sort of the liberal, the left side of the liberal party in the United States, the Democratic Party, ends up being very hostile to guns and to armed resistance. How can groups like the John Brown Gun Club, which is very supportive of leftist organizing, certainly here in Rhode Island and throughout wherever the John Brown Gun Club operates, how can specifically the John Brown Gun Club work to build a broader leftist solidarity around armed struggle?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of those things that can be a little frustrating about our organizing sometimes, because I'll be talking with somebody, they're in a leftish, I think, the broad term that doesn't really seem to have a very pinned down meaning, progressive, tends to get thrown around out there. So I'll talk to plenty of progressive people. I'll tell them all about the work we do with the unhoused community, that we go out and we try and make sure that if folks are forced to sleep outside, that they at least have food, water, and if it's winter, that we can give them at the very least hand warmers, emergency blankets, and maybe like hat and gloves. I tell people about that, and it's all great. And they're like, oh, cool. What group do you do that with? And I say the Rhode Island John Brown, and the smile's still there. Everybody's great. And then I say gun club, and then they're okay, bye, and they just leave because there's this idea, and I think here in New England, it's pretty ingrained that if you're doing anything, if you support firearms ownership, you must be a bigot or some loon who thinks that everybody needs to have, like, again, an AK-47 in a Walmart or something. And so there's kind of two parts of this, because appealing to people who are on the liberal spectrum of things is a lot harder, I think, than appealing to people who are self-identified as being on the left. Because if you think that you're going to get fundamental change in this country by voting for the Democratic Party and getting them to vote for better laws, then it's going to be hard to explain to that group of people why it's necessary for poor and oppressed people to be armed, because you're believing in a state process that generated the oppression of those people in the first place. So with folks that are on the more liberal end of things, I have to end up getting into this whole long discussion of like why we need socialism in the first place. But for people who are on the left, my appeal would be pretty simple, and it kind of goes back to something we were already talking about, which is that if communities aren't armed and capable of defending themselves, the only group they have to turn to is the police. And I don't know how many of us on the left really ever, but especially post 2020, think that that's the way that we're going to protect the communities of the marginalized in this country. Like, I don't know how anybody could hold that conception in their head and be somebody who wants a truly better world that is actually fighting for an actual egalitarian society. And so I would just point to this, and it's like, again, if our communities don't defend themselves, the only people that will be in that position are the same people that are currently oppressing them. And that's really the argument that the Black Panthers were making. Again, they launched as the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. Like, that was in their name because of how vital they felt it was. And so with the question, like, while a lot of that was focused specifically on like national oppression, like where you had like a specifically Black organization, or you have AIM, the American Indian Movement, which is also targeted by COINTELPRO, focusing specifically on, you know, indigenous liberation. Not that there's anything wrong with that. It's still great to have like groups that are fighting specifically on those issues. They certainly haven't been solved, so there's a lot of goddamn work to do. But when we're even to move beyond that, when we're fighting to build like, you know, a multi-ethnic working class alliance in this country to actually push for a socialist system, it comes down to that, like, what we're seeing right now in this country is a massive upsurge in violence from the fascist right in this country. They're emboldened by the embrace of fascism by the Republican Party and the complete lack of any action by the Democratic Party whatsoever to do anything to stop them, largely because of the integration of these fascist forces with the police, who are the organization that defend the property of the ruling class that controls both parties. So, like, understanding all of that, it comes down to the question of, like, do we trust the police to protect Black communities, LGBTQ communities, like migrant communities, indigenous communities in this country from violence, when they're the ones are commonly committing that violence or assisting fascists in doing it? Like, for instance, we've seen in events in Texas and other places where the Proud Boys show up to harass like a drag story time hour, and they get let in and escorted by the police. So those are the groups. That's the alternative that you're looking to if you don't support community self-defense is, well, look, I would support that, but I don't want to have guns, so the only other option is the police. And I don't accept that, to be honest, as the only alternative. I think people are capable of defending their own communities. And there's no reason why we should leave the protection from fascists for these oppressed communities in the hands of a group that doesn't want to protect them. There's no reason why these communities can't protect themselves, because that's the other thing about our work with the John Brown Gun Club. We don't ever want to be seen as like we're coming in to help people who desperately need us. We want to come in and help people defend themselves. Like, that's one of the things that we really pride ourselves on doing, is if folks who are not comfortable going and seeking out firearms safety training, just basic handling information, like or just have questions. And they don't want to go to a group like the NRA, which is totally understandable because they're fascists. So like I totally get that. So one of the things that we pride ourselves on doing is trying to help those communities be able to defend themselves, because that's really, I think, not only key to protecting ourselves from rising fascism, but that sort of community empowerment can be really important to building a broader socialist project where we say, yes, our communities can in fact run themselves, and they don't need to have this tiny class of people who happen to have $1 billion because they're stealing all of the profits made by their workers to run our society for us. And so that's my pitch to the left on why they should support this sort of stuff.
There is no reason why communities can't defend themselves. You heard it here, folks. So unfortunately, that does bring us to the end of our discussion here this evening. I want to thank Dan from Rhode Island John Brown Gun Club one more time. Thank you so much for being here. It was a really enlightening conversation. I think we heard a lot about the roots of the Second Amendment, the impact that it's had on the United States, and what can we as leftists do in the future in order to help continue protecting communities while also addressing the very real roots of violence. We will be back here Tuesday, October 18th at Reading Community Library at 6:30 p.m. to talk about the Sixth Amendment and the right to due process in the United States with Rhode Island DARE, the Direct Action for Rights and Equality. So please join us once again Tuesday evening, October 18th at 6:30 p.m. Where we will take on due process and how the right to a fair trial has been eroded by capitalism. Thanks again, everybody, for coming this evening. Thanks for everybody on the live stream, and hope to see you again soon.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Is the John
Make a lot of good
Brown
edits
Gun
with the-
Club connected with the SRA?
Not directly. It's so SRA is kind of doing a different thing. We have a little bit of overlap.
Okay.
Not that we have any. It's like not like no, we don't like this. Or not like
Figure it out.
it's the
I can make a video
SRA
on
is
Sunday.
focused
I gotta wake up
specifically
at 6
on being
a.m.
like purely an educational organization as an alternative